August 17, 1945. 2:14 p.m. British military compound, 17 kilometers southeast of Rangoon. The air was thick with monsoon heat, the kind that made fabric cling in breath labor. 147 Japanese soldiers stood in formation on gravel that radiated stored warmth through the soles of their boots. They had surrendered 3 days earlier, laying down rifles that had become too heavy to carry, stepping forward with hands raised and eyes fixed on the ground. 6 months they had spent in jungle positions without resupply, without clean water, without the means to maintain even the most basic standards of hygiene. Their uniforms were stiff with accumulated grime, their skin layered with dirt and insect bites and the residue of survival. They stank of sweat and mud and the particular odor of bodies unwashed for half a year. They expected contempt. They expected humiliation. What they received was a British sergeant pointing toward a row of newly constructed wooden structures and saying in careful Japanese, "Baths first. Then food." The sergeant was perhaps 40, with graying hair and the kind of weathered face that suggested service in multiple theaters. He carried a clipboard and wore an expression of bureaucratic neutrality, not kindness, not hostility, just the practiced calm of a man executing a procedure he had been trained to follow. Behind him, a dozen British soldiers stood at ease, rifles slung over shoulders, watching the formation with curiosity rather than malice. The Japanese prisoners did not move. They stood rigid, waiting for clarification, for the revelation that this was mockery or some elaborate prelude to punishment. One prisoner, a corporal named Takeshi, 26, who had served in the Burma campaign since 1942, glanced sideways at the structures the sergeant had indicated. They were simple wooden bathhouses, steam rising from vents in the roofs, water barrels visible through open doorways. Real baths. Not rivers or rain or the occasional bucket of filthy water rationed among 30 men. Actual facilities built for the purpose of washing. The sergeant noticed the hesitation. He stepped forward, his boots crunching on gravel, and repeated himself, this time more slowly. Baths. Hot water. Soap. You will go in groups of 10. Remove your uniforms. Wash. New clothes will be provided. Do you understand? Takeshi understood the words. He did not understand the intention behind them. In 6 months of retreat and starvation and fighting rearguard actions against Allied forces that outnumbered and outgunned them at every turn, he had learned to mistrust mercy. Mercy was a trap. Mercy was propaganda. Mercy was the thing you were promised before they took everything else. But the sergeant was waiting. And behind the prisoners, more British soldiers were approaching with wooden crates stacked on handcarts, supplies, clothing, something organized and prepared in advance. This was not improvisation. This was policy. The first 10 prisoners were called forward. Takeshi was among them. They walked toward the bathhouses with the careful steps of men approaching a minefield, every muscle tense for the moment the ground would shift beneath them. The sergeant opened the door to the first structure and gestured inside. 10 minutes each group. Do not rush. There is time. Inside, the bathhouse was simple but functional, wooden benches, buckets of hot water drawn from a boiler outside, bars of soap wrapped in paper stamped with the insignia of the British Red Cross, clean towels folded on a shelf. Steam rose from the water, carrying with it the clean, almost medicinal smell of lye soap. Takeshi stood in the doorway, staring at the scene as if it were a hallucination. A British private, barely 20, with pale skin that had burned red under the Burmese sun, demonstrated the process. He filled a bucket, poured it over his own arms to show the temperature was safe, then set the bucket down and stepped back. Water is hot. Soap is here. Take your time. His Japanese was halting, clearly learned from a phrase book, but comprehensible. Takeshi removed his uniform slowly, peeling fabric away from skin that had fused with sweat and dirt. The other prisoners did the same, moving with the cautious precision of men performing a ritual they no longer fully trusted. They stood naked, skeletal, scarred, and began to wash. The first pour of water was shock. Heat against skin that had known only cold rivers and tropical rain. Takeshi scrubbed with the soap, watching 6 months of accumulated filth dissolve and run in dark rivulets onto the wooden floor where drains had been cut to channel the water away. He scrubbed until his skin was raw, until the water ran clear, until he could no longer remember what it felt like to be this clean. Around him, the others washed in silence. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. Words would have cheapened the moment, reduced it to something explicable when what they were experiencing defied explanation. They had been told that surrender meant death, that the enemy would torture and humiliate them, that captivity was a fate worse than dying in battle. They had been told many things. None of those things included this, hot water, soap, privacy, time. If this moment already changed how you see the war, subscribe, the next will surprise you even more. The 147 Japanese soldiers who stood in formation that August afternoon had been part of the 28th Army, a force that had fought a grinding, desperate campaign through Burma as the tide of war turned irrevocably against Japan. They had retreated through jungle and swamp, harassed by Allied aircraft, decimated by disease and starvation, cut off from supply lines that no longer existed. By the time the order to surrender came, transmitted via radio from command structures that were themselves collapsing, they were less an army than a collection of survivors held together by discipline and the faint hope that surrender might be preferable to death in a jungle that had become their grave. The decision to surrender had not been easy. For many, it violated every principle they had been taught, every code they had internalized. But the alternative was annihilation, and even the most devoted soldiers recognized that dying for a cause already lost served no purpose. So they had walked out of the jungle, laid down their weapons, and waited to see what mercy looked like in the hands of an enemy they had been taught to fear. The transport from the surrender point to the compound had taken 2 days. They were loaded onto trucks, British lorries with canvas covers, and driven along roads that had been bombed and rebuilt, past villages that had been destroyed and were now beginning the slow process of recovery. They traveled in silence, watching the landscape pass, seeing evidence of the war's devastation everywhere. Burnt-out tanks, collapsed bridges, fields scarred by artillery, the remnants of battles they had fought or fled from. When they arrived at the compound, they were met not with violence but with organization. Guards directed them into formation. Clerks recorded names and units. Medical personnel moved through the ranks, identifying those with serious injuries or illnesses and separating them for immediate treatment. It was all procedural, methodical, absent of cruelty but also absent of warmth. Just the machinery of military administration processing defeated enemies with the same efficiency it would process supplies or requisition forms. But then the sergeant with the clipboard had appeared, had pointed toward the bathhouses, had spoken those words that seemed impossible: baths first. Then food. After the first group finished washing, they were directed to an adjacent structure where clean uniforms had been laid out, standard-issue prisoner clothing, simple and utilitarian but intact and clean. Tokishi dressed slowly, feeling the texture of fabric that had not been worn threadbare, that did not carry the weight of months in the jungle. His old uniform was collected and placed in a pile for burning. He watched it go without sentiment. It was not a uniform anymore. It was evidence of survival, and survival did not require souvenirs. The remaining prisoners cycled through the bathhouses in groups of 10, each group given the same 10 minutes, the same soap, the same clean water. The British soldiers maintained the system with quiet efficiency, refilling boilers, replacing soap, ensuring the process continued without interruption. No one shouted. No one struck anyone. The guards simply stood watch, ensuring order, allowing the prisoners the dignity of washing themselves without observation or commentary. By late afternoon, all 147 had bathed. They stood again in formation, this time in clean clothes, skin scrubbed, hair washed, looking more like soldiers and less like the emaciated specters they had been hours earlier. The transformation was not merely physical. Something in their posture had changed, a subtle easing of the tension that had held them rigid with fear and expectation. They were still prisoners. They were still defeated. But they were clean, and in that cleanliness was a recognition that they remained human. The philosophy that guided this treatment had been codified decades earlier in the Geneva Conventions, refined through centuries of military practice, and reinforced by directives issued from the highest levels of British command. A document circulated among camp administrators in 1944 made the principles explicit. Prisoners of war retain their dignity regardless of the crimes committed by their nation. Humane treatment is not mercy, it is obligation. Restraint under pressure is the measure of civilization. 3 pillars supported the policy, repeated so often in training and briefings that they became reflexive. Security: prisoners would be contained, monitored, prevented from escape or sabotage. Diplomacy: humane treatment protected British POWs held in Japanese camps and maintained Britain's moral standing among allies and neutral observers. Morality: to abandon restraint was to become indistinguishable from the enemy, to betray the principles that justified the war in the first place. These were not abstract ideals. They were enacted daily in the decisions of sergeants and guards and administrators who chose to build bathhouses rather than simply hose prisoners down in the open, who provided soap and time and privacy rather than the minimum required to prevent disease. Each small act of compliance with the standard was a thread in the fabric that held civilization together when everything else threatened to unravel. The prisoners were fed that evening in a mess tent erected specifically for their use. The meal was simple: rice, tinned vegetables, tea, but it was hot and it was sufficient. Portions were measured to prevent illness from overeating after prolonged malnutrition, but second helpings were allowed for those who could tolerate them. Takeshi ate slowly, savoring each mouthful, feeling strength return to muscles that had atrophied during the months of starvation rations. Around him, the others ate in the same deliberate silence that had characterized the bathing. They were adapting, adjusting to a reality that contradicted everything they had been prepared for. The propaganda had told them that surrender meant torture, that the British and Americans were barbaric, that captivity was a descent into hell. But this was not hell. This was order. This was routine. This was the quiet, unglamorous machinery of an army that had prepared for the influx of prisoners and had allocated resources accordingly. After the meal, they were led to barracks, long wooden structures with rows of cots, each with a thin mattress and a wool blanket. The accommodations were Spartan but adequate. Guards were posted at the doors, not to intimidate but to maintain security and respond to needs. A British officer, a captain with a clipped accent and a translator at his side, addressed them briefly. "You are prisoners of war under the protection of international law. You will be treated in accordance with that law. You will be given work assignments appropriate to your rank and condition. You will receive mail through the Red Cross. You will be allowed to send letters to your families. Escape attempts will be punished, but humane treatment will continue. Do you have questions?" No one spoke. Questions implied negotiation, and negotiation implied a power they did not possess. They simply listened, absorbing information, filing it away for later consideration when the shock of the day's events had subsided enough to allow thought. The officer nodded. "Tomorrow you will be assigned to work details. Rest tonight. You have earned it." The translation rippled through the group. Rest. And. Such strange words to hear from a captor. Takeshi lay on his cot that night, staring at the ceiling of the barracks, listening to the sounds of 146 other men breathing, coughing, shifting in sleep. He thought about the bathhouse, the soap, the clean water. He thought about the sergeant who had pointed the way and spoken without malice. He thought about propaganda and reality and the growing suspicion that he had been lied to about many things. "I expected to die," he would write years later in a letter to a former comrade. "I expected cruelty. I expected the kind of treatment we had given others. But the British built bathhouses. They gave us soap. They allowed us to wash ourselves with privacy and time, as if we were still worthy of dignity. I did not understand it then. I am not certain I understand it now. But I remember it. I will always remember it." The days that followed established a routine that became familiar through repetition. Morning roll call at 0600. Breakfast at 0630, porridge, bread, tea. Work assignments at 0730. The prisoners were divided according to skills and physical condition. Those with construction experience were assigned to repair details, rebuilding damaged infrastructure in the surrounding area. Those with medical training worked in the camp infirmary alongside British medics. Those with clerical skills were put to work in the administrative offices, sorting paperwork, translating documents, assisting with the processing of other prisoners. The work was supervised but not oppressive. British guards maintained order without brutality, correcting mistakes with instructions rather than punishments, allowing prisoners the autonomy to complete tasks without constant observation. Breaks were scheduled, water was provided, and no one was worked beyond their physical capacity. It was labor, but it was labor with limits, governed by rules that applied equally to all. Takeshi was assigned to a construction detail repairing a damaged warehouse on the compound's western edge. He worked alongside a dozen other prisoners under the supervision of a British corporal who spoke no Japanese but communicated effectively through gestures and demonstrations. The corporal showed them what needed to be done, replacing rotted beams, patching the roof, reinforcing walls, and then allowed them to work with minimal interference. When Takeshi made an error in measurement, the corporal simply corrected it without anger or condescension, showing the proper technique and moving on. At midday, they broke for lunch: sandwiches, fruit, water. The corporal ate with them, sitting on a stack of lumber and smoking a cigarette, watching the clouds roll in from the east. After a few days, he began to speak, slow, simple English phrases accompanied by exaggerated gestures. "Good work. Hot today. Rain coming." Takeshi responded in equally simple Japanese, knowing the corporal did not understand but appreciating the attempt at communication. Language was unnecessary. The act of speaking itself was the message. "You are here, I am here, we are doing this together." Among the prisoners, bonds formed gradually, cautiously, built on shared experience and the slow erosion of the fear that had defined their first days in captivity. There was Hiroshi, 32, a sergeant who had fought in China before being transferred to Burma, who carried himself with the rigid discipline of a career soldier. There was Kenji, 19, a private who had been conscripted 2 years earlier and who still looked like a boy despite everything he had endured. There was Soburo, 28, a medic who had tried to save men with nothing but bandages and hope, who now worked in the British infirmary and spoke with quiet admiration about the supplies and training the British medics possessed. Each carried his own burdens, his own doubts, his own strategies for survival. They shared rations, exchanged news from letters that arrived sporadically through the Red Cross, comforted each other in the long hours after lights out when the darkness amplified every fear. They were not friends, not yet, but they were comrades in uncertainty, bound by the shared experience of having survived what they had been told was unsurvivable. Hiroshi kept a diary, writing in pencil on scraps of paper he collected from the administrative office where he was assigned. His entries were terse, factual, stripped of emotion. August 21st. Worked on road repair. British corporal demonstrated proper use of tamping tool. Hands blistered but healing. Received letter from wife, she is alive, living with her sister in Osaka. First news in 8 months. Did not cry until after lights out. August 28th. Watched British soldiers play football in the evening. Strange to see men at play. One soldier invited prisoners to join. No one accepted. Trust requires time we do not yet have. September 3rd. Bathhouse repaired after storm damage. British ensured it was operational before other repairs. Priorities reveal values. They value our cleanliness. I am beginning to understand why. If you're seeing this war in a new light, subscribe, the next scene will challenge you even more. The ideological shift happens slowly, in fragments, in moments that accumulated until the weight of experience overcame the weight of propaganda. For many prisoners, the process began with small observations that contradicted what they had been taught. The British guards did not beat them. The food, while modest, was consistent. Medical care was provided without discrimination. Letters were delivered. Work was supervised but not cruel. Each small decency chipped away at the narrative that had sustained them through years of war. One afternoon in late September, Takeshi was working on the warehouse roof when a British soldier, a private named Thomas, 23, with a Yorkshire accent and a ready smile, climbed up with a thermos of tea. He poured 2 cups, handed one to Takeshi, and sat down on the edge of the roof, legs dangling over the side. Good work, Thomas said, gesturing at the repaired section of roof. Takeshi nodded. Thank you. They sat in silence for a few minutes, drinking tea, watching the compound below where other prisoners moved through their routines. Finally, Thomas pulled a photograph from his pocket, a woman and 2 young children standing in front of a brick house. He showed it to Takeshi. My wife. My kids. Haven't seen them in 3 years. Takeshi looked at the photograph. He thought about his own family, his own wife who had written that she was alive but offered no details about how she had survived the firebombing of Osaka. He thought about the children he did not have, the future he had assumed was lost. He handed the photograph back. They are beautiful. Thomas smiled, tucking the photograph away. War's over. Maybe I'll see them soon. Maybe. You have family? Wife. In Osaka. You'll see her again. Repatriation is coming. They're organizing transports. Takeshi did not respond. Repatriation meant returning to a Japan he no longer recognized, a nation defeated and occupied, a society that had been taught that surrender was the ultimate dishonor. He did not know what awaited him there. He did not know if his wife would welcome him back or if the shame of his survival would outweigh the relief of his return. Thomas drained his tea and stood. Back to work. But take your time. No rush. He climbed down, leaving Takeshi alone on the roof with his thoughts and a cup of British tea that had grown cold. It was such a small gesture, this sharing of tea and photographs. But it was also profound. The enemy had a face now. The enemy had a family, a home, a reason to fight that was not abstract or ideological but deeply, simply human. The propaganda had made the enemy into monsters. The reality was men who poured tea and showed pictures of their children and worked alongside prisoners as if peace were already here. In October, the compound held a service to commemorate the end of the war. Prisoners were not required to attend, but many did, curious to see how the British would mark the occasion. A chaplain, a captain with grey hair and a gentle voice, spoke briefly about loss and reconciliation, about the necessity of moving forward without forgetting the past, about the hope that the peace would last longer than the war. He read from the Bible, then from a Buddhist text, acknowledging the diversity of belief among those present. It was a small gesture, this inclusion, but it resonated. After the service, the chaplain approached several prisoners, speaking through a translator, asking if anyone wished to talk, offering comfort without condescension. Saburo, the medic, spoke with him for nearly an hour, sharing stories of the men he had tried to save, the guilt he carried for those he had lost. The chaplain listened without judgment, offering no easy absolution but providing the space for grief to be expressed. That evening, Saburo wrote in his own makeshift diary, "The chaplain told me that guilt is the price of caring. He said that the fact I feel it means I have not lost my humanity. I want to believe him. I want to believe that surviving does not mean betraying those who did not." By November, the first repatriation orders arrived. Prisoners would be transported back to Japan in groups, beginning with those who were ill or injured, followed by those who had been in captivity the longest. The process would take months, logistics were complicated, ships were scarce, and the sheer number of displaced persons across Asia meant that no one could move quickly. Takeshi was informed he would be in the third group, scheduled to depart in January. The news brought relief and anxiety in equal measure. Relief because captivity, however humane, was still captivity. Anxiety because he did not know what Japan would look like, how he would be received, whether the life he had left behind still existed in any recognizable form. In the weeks before departure, the prisoners were given the opportunity to send letters home, informing families of their survival and impending return. Takeshi wrote to his wife, a letter that took him 3 drafts to complete because he could not find words adequate to the complexity of what he needed to say. He settled finally on simplicity: "I am alive. I am coming home. Wait for me." The reply came 2 weeks later, delivered by the Red Cross. His wife's handwriting was shaky, the paper thin and cheap, but the words were clear: "I am waiting. Come home safely." He folded the letter carefully and placed it in the pocket of his uniform, next to his heart, where it would remain until he boarded the ship that would carry him across the sea. On the morning of departure, the prisoners assembled one final time in the compound's central yard. The British commandant, a colonel who had overseen the camp since its establishment, addressed them through a translator. His words were formal, procedural, but not without warmth. "You came here as enemies. You leave as men who have endured much and who deserve the chance to rebuild. The war is over. The future is uncertain. But you have survived, and survival is the first step toward whatever comes next. Go home. Live well. Remember that restraint, not vengeance, is the mark of civilization." The prisoners bowed, a gesture of respect that transcended ideology. The colonel returned the bow. Then they were loaded onto trucks, transported to the port, and placed aboard a transport ship bound for Japan. Takeshi stood on the deck as the ship pulled away from the dock, watching the coast of Burma recede into the distance. He thought about the bathhouse, the soap, the British sergeant who had pointed the way. He thought about Thomas and his photograph, the chaplain and his quiet listening, the colonel and his final words. He thought about propaganda and reality and the slow, painful process of unlearning lies. Decades later, in a memoir written for his grandchildren, Takeshi would reflect on those months in British captivity. The memoir was brief, understated, reluctant to claim too much or impose too neat a narrative on events that had been messy and contradictory. But one passage captured the essence of what he had experienced. "We had been told that surrender meant death, that the enemy would destroy us not merely physically but morally, that captivity would strip us of everything that made us human. We believed this because we had been given no reason to doubt it. But the British did not destroy us. They did not humiliate us. They built bathhouses. They gave us soap and time and privacy. They treated us as if we were still worthy of dignity, even when we were not certain we deserved it. I do not claim this erases what was done in the war. I do not claim it justifies anything. I claim only that it happened, and that it mattered, and that I carried it with me for the rest of my life." His grandchildren would read the memoir years after his death, when enough time had passed that the war was history rather than memory. They would ask their parents what it meant, why their grandfather had written it, what lesson they were supposed to draw from it. The answers were uncertain, provisional, shaped by distance and the impossibility of fully understanding experiences they had not lived. But the story itself remained, preserved in careful handwriting, a testament to the possibility of restraint even in the midst of collapse. The transport ship arrived in Japan in late January 1946. The prisoners disembarked in Yokohama, stepping onto a dock crowded with returning soldiers, displaced civilians, and the administrative machinery of occupation. The city was scarred, broken, rebuilding under the watchful eyes of American forces who now governed what had once been the heart of an empire. Takashi walked through streets he did not recognize, past buildings that had been reduced to rubble, through crowds of people whose faces carried the same exhaustion and confusion he felt. His wife met him at a processing center, her face thin and lined but her eyes bright with relief. They embraced, wordless, holding each other as if the act of touching could confirm what letters and hope had promised. Later, they would talk, about the war, about survival, about the future they would try to build in a nation that had been utterly transformed. But in that moment, there was only the embrace, the confirmation of life, the beginning of whatever came next. Takashi returned to work as a carpenter, a trade he had learned before the war and that served him well in a city desperate for reconstruction. He rebuilt houses, schools, shops, small contributions to a process that would take decades. He did not speak often of the war, of Burma, of the months in British captivity. When asked, he would offer only brief, factual responses, deflecting questions that probed too deeply into experiences he was still processing. But he kept the letter from his wife, the one that had reached him in the camp, folded and refolded until the creases threatened to tear the paper apart. He kept the memory of the bathhouse, the soap, the British sergeant who had spoken without malice. He kept the photograph Thomas had shown him, or rather the memory of it, the evidence that enemies were also men with families and futures and reasons to hope. In 1963, a historian researching post-war repatriation contacted Takashi, asking if he would be willing to share his experiences. Takashi hesitated, then agreed. The interview lasted 3 hours, conducted in a small office in Tokyo, recorded on a reel-to-reel tape that would eventually be archived in a university library. The historian asked about conditions in the camp, about treatment by British personnel, about the transition from soldier to prisoner to civilian. Takashi answered carefully, choosing words that captured complexity without dramatizing or minimizing. At the end, the historian asked, "What do you want people to understand about that time?" Takashi thought for a long moment. Then he said, "That decency is not weakness. The British could have treated us as we had treated others. They could have responded to cruelty with cruelty, to brutality with brutality. But they chose restraint. They built bathhouses. They provided soap and time and privacy. They treated us as if we were still human, even when we were not certain we deserved it. That choice, that refusal to become what they fought, is what separates civilization from chaos. I want people to know that even in the worst circumstances, even when vengeance would have been justified, decency remained possible. Not because it was easy. Not because we earned it. But because they believed it was right." The historian published his findings in an academic journal that reached a modest audience. Takashi's testimony was quoted, his words preserved alongside those of other prisoners who had experienced similar treatment. The story did not become famous. It did not reshape historical narratives or change popular understanding of the war. It simply entered the record, one more piece of evidence that restraint, however rare, was possible. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these tales matter. Please subscribe to this channel and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. Now, let's continue. Takashi lived until 1998, dying at the age of 79 in the house he had rebuilt after the war, surrounded by children and grandchildren who carried his name and his memory into a century he would not see. His funeral was attended by family, by neighbors, by former colleagues who remembered him as a quiet man who worked hard and spoke little. No one mentioned the war unless prompted. It was ancient history by then, a chapter closed, a story told and retold until it became something other than lived experience. His family found the memoir afterward, tucked into a drawer along with letters and photographs and the ephemera of a long life. They read it together, learning for the first time the details of what he had endured and survived. One grandson, a student of history, was struck by a particular passage, underlined in faded ink. The British sergeant who pointed toward the bathhouses never knew what his gesture meant. To him, it was procedure, nothing more: direct the prisoners, maintain order, move on to the next task. But to me, standing in that compound with 6 months of filth on my skin and 6 years of propaganda in my mind, it was everything. It was proof that decency had survived, that restraint still existed, that the war had not entirely destroyed the possibility of mercy. I have spent my life trying to understand that moment, trying to reconcile it with everything else I had been taught and believed. I am not certain I ever succeeded. But I remember it. I will always remember it. The grandson donated the memoir to a research institute specializing in wartime testimonies. It sits now in a climate-controlled archive, available to scholars, a testament to the possibility of restraint when restraint seemed impossible. The bathhouses themselves were dismantled in 1947, when the compound was decommissioned and the land returned to civilian use. The wood was repurposed, the materials salvaged, the structures erased as if they had never existed. But the memory remained, carried by the men who had washed there, who had felt hot water and soap for the first time in 6 months, who had been granted the dignity of cleanliness when they had expected only contempt. Some of those men returned to Japan and rebuilt their lives, as Takeshi had. Others did not survive the journey home, succumbing to illness or injury or the accumulated weight of trauma. Some chose to remain silent about their experiences, carrying their memories privately, unwilling or unable to speak of what they had endured. Others, like Takeshi, spoke carefully, selectively, preserving their stories for those who asked the right questions. The history of that compound, of those bathhouses, of the British decision to treat prisoners with restraint rather than vengeance, is not widely known. It does not appear in popular histories of the war. It is not commemorated with monuments or memorials. It exists instead in scattered testimonies, in archived documents, in the careful research of historians who sift through records looking for evidence of how people behaved when the structures of civilization were tested and strained but not entirely broken. What remains is this: in August 1945, 147 Japanese soldiers surrendered in Burma. They had not bathed in 6 months. They expected cruelty. They received soap, hot water, and time. A British sergeant pointed toward bathhouses that had been built specifically for them and said, in careful Japanese, "Baths first. Then food." That gesture, that refusal to treat defeated enemies as less than human, was not heroism. It was policy enacted by ordinary soldiers who believed that restraint was the mark of civilization and that to abandon restraint was to become indistinguishable from the enemy. It was the quiet, unglamorous choice to maintain standards when standards no longer seemed to matter, to uphold dignity when dignity would have been easier to discard. The war had taught them propaganda. The bathhouses taught them restraint. And in that contradiction, in that moment when expectation collided with reality, something shifted, not absolution, not forgiveness, but the recognition that decency survived, that mercy was possible, that the future might hold something other than the past endlessly repeated. The monsoon air was thick, the gravel radiated heat, and 147 men stood waiting to discover what surrender meant. What they found was hot water, soap, and the possibility that even enemies deserved dignity. The war had taught them fear, restraint taught them that civilization endures.